This episode is sponsored by Squarespace. Whether you need a domain, website, or online store, make your next move with Squarespace. One of the genres of photography I engage in are environmental portraits. And that basically describes portraits taken in a setting outside of a studio in the real world. And you've got a very fine line to ride when you take those sort of portraits, because on the one hand, you definitely want the environment around you to feature in the image. It's part of the point of making an image of someone in context to help to tell a story. But on the other side of things, you don't want that background to become too distracting. So to make my subjects stand out from the background, I've got a few options. I could bring in some lighting and make sure that they're the brightest thing in the image and make them pop out of that background. I could use clever compositional techniques to make sure that the background that they're standing in isn't too busy, or I can use a shallower depth of field to hide a lot of the distraction and the details of that background in the blur and the bokeh behind them. And one of the reasons that for years I really wanted a medium format camera was, to my eye, it seemed like the perfect tool to make environmental portraits with. I'd seen loads of shots where the context really just faded into the background in a way that made the shot feel really three-dimensional, and the subject, even if they were shot full length, seemed to stand out for that background and be a lot sharper than everything else around them. But when it came to medium format, it was more than just a shallow depth of field that I was seeing. Because let's be honest, getting a shallow depth of field isn't actually that hard. All you need is a long focal length, like a 200mm or a 300mm lens, where even at 2.8, you're going to have a super shallow depth of field where your subject is sharp and your background is really blurry. I think the quality we most readily associate with medium format photography is not just about shallow depth of field. It's actually about a combination of two things. And the one is being able to have that wider focal length, that wider angle to your shot, and still have a really shallow depth of field where your subject is very sharp against the background. It's that wide and shallow look. Now, medium format cameras have come down in price a lot over the years, but they're still prohibitively expensive for a lot of us. But what if I told you that I think you can actually achieve that wide and shallow look with the camera that you probably already have sitting in your camera bag? And that's what I want to show you today. Let's start with a little theory. Okay, so let's talk about sensor sizes just briefly. And I've got a lens here. It's the Sony G Master 50mm f1.2. And I want you to imagine that there's an image being projected through this lens, and it's being projected out onto this piece of paper underneath. And we're going to imagine that this piece of paper is our sensor. So I'm just going to grab a jug here, just so we can visualize what I'm doing. And just in the middle of this page, I'm going to draw perhaps what it would actually project out. We often don't think about this, but lenses, if they're spherical lenses like this one is, we actually project circles of images onto our sensors. It's only because our images are usually rectangle or square that we actually pick up rectangle or square shaped images. But the image being projected is circular through circular lenses. Now, let's start with our full frame sensor, something that just sort of sits in the middle. We know that we have a 50mm lens at f1.2. That's the potential widest aperture we can have on this lens. So it would pick up what's being projected centrally on this actual lens on the sensor, on the full frame sensor. So let's pop this down here for a second. And we always talk about lenses in full frame terms. That's the baseline that we actually use. But I prepared something here that roughly estimates, in terms of a size comparison, what medium format is versus full frame. So the medium format sensor would actually pick up more of the image than the full frame sensor would. And I'm assuming here, of course, that this lens will project wide enough to fill a medium format sensor. I don't know if that's actually true in the case of this lens, but I just want to show you the concept of how this works. So you can see here that what would happen is this lens would be picking up more of the image would be picked up by that medium format sensor. Now I know, say for example, that if this is representing a GFX sensor, like the Fuji GFX medium format range, what we would need to do to work out what focal length we're actually projecting here is to times that by 0.8, which would give us a 40mm lens. Again, at that 1.2. So this would pick up 50mm in full frame terms. If it could fill a medium format sensor, it would be taking in more of the image at that 1.2, so it would be giving a wider image with a shallow depth of field at 40mm instead, okay? Now I've prepared a little APS-C one as well, just so we can see a size comparison. Medium format, full frame, APS-C is a smaller sensor again, so it's really just going to be taking out the middle of the image that's being projected in this scenario. And I know for an APS-C sensor, something like maybe the Fuji XT range, we would have to times this by 1.5 to work out what our new focal length is. So in this case, we would have a 75mm image being projected in full frame terms, even though the lens in all these three examples is a 50mm in terms of the actual lens construction. So you can see here that the same projection from the same lens, if it could fill this medium format, in medium format terms, we would be having a 40mm at 1.2. Full frame, we would be having a 50mm at 1.2. Same projection, just different sensor size. And at this APS-C size, we'd be having a 75mm at 1.2. Right, so I hope that makes sense. You've got your different sensor sizes in our head. Now the question is, if I can't afford a medium format sensor because they're quite pricey, could I take something like a full frame and try and make my image be captured as wide and shallow as it would on a medium format sensor with just this sensor? You can see that it's much smaller. So what are we going to do? Well, what if I flip it like this? And what if I take 3 shots instead of 1 shot, right? If I stack them and just overlay them slightly, I'm now covering something that is the same, in fact slightly wider than that medium format would pick up. So if I chose to take 3 shots and stitch them together on a full frame sensor, I could be getting the same kind of coverage as I would get from a medium format sensor, and that would give me that wider but shallow look, replicating something that's a wider focal length but keeping this shallow depth of field. Right, so that gives you an example on full frame. Could I do the same with APS-C? Well, we've got a long way to go here because you can see APS-C is much smaller than medium format. So what could I do? Well, I'd have to take more shots, wouldn't I? So that's 1, but thankfully I've got a few more of these. Maybe we do this, and this, and this, and this, and this. What if I took 6 shots that stacked up and overlapped slightly? Then I could actually give the same sort of coverage as a medium format sensor would get, and I could get something, again, with this small sensor, I could get something that's as wide as this, so wider focal length, but still that very shallow depth of field, replicating what the image would look like if I was shooting it on a medium format sensor. This is actually an old technique. It's been around for a while. In fact, I was using this technique 12 years ago. Back then it was called the Brenizer technique because it was popularized by a wedding photographer named Ryan Brenizer, who used to take multiple images, stitch them together to get that super wide but shallow look. And I got really carried away. I was using 85mm on a full frame, and sometimes I was stitching 20 to 30 shots together, and the look was way too strong. But if you use this method subtly, like I've described here, I think you can get very close to the look of those larger sensors. Let me show you how. So we're out here in the woods. It's a great spot for an environmental portrait. Stacy's kindly agreed to help us out. And I need to balance the subject now with the background. I want the background to be a feature, but I don't want it to distract too much. So the easiest way to do that is to use the bokeh and let the background disappear into that blur. So I'm going to use my depth of field to do that. So let's start with the medium format camera. I picked this up recently. It's the Fuji GFX 50R, and I've teamed it with the Mitakon 65mm 1.4 lens. And for me, this setup in digital gives you the closest to that really traditional medium format look, where everything feels really three-dimensional. It feels a lot like, in film terms, the old Pentax 6.7 with the 105mm lens, which for me was always the gold standard for environmental portraits. It's a little bit of a nightmare to use because the lens is manual focus only, and the depth of field gets so shallow, you really have to be accurate. So you've got to kind of punch in on the viewfinder so you can really see and then fine tune that focus. But if you slow everything down, it's fine. And I mean, you know, back in the day, we used to have to do 5-8 second exposures when we were doing these kind of large format things on glass plates. So it's quite nice to slow it down sometimes with your subject and just be able to now focus and take shots slowly. So my settings here at the moment in this environment are ISO 400. I'm on 1.4 obviously because I want that shallow depth of field. and shutter speed is 1/250th of a second. So I'm just going to take a few shots. I'm going to use these medium format shots as kind of that base level, and we're going to try and match the shots we get with the other camera to this medium format look. So let's move to the full frame camera. For the full frame, I'm using my Sony a7R IV, and I've teamed that with a 50mm f1.2, the Sony version. Ideally in this setup, if I was going to do a comparison like for like, I would want to use a 65mm, but I don't have a 65mm for this camera. So I'm going to have to get as close as I can with a fast prime, and the closest I've got is this 50mm 1.2. So the technique that I'm going to use is to take the 3 shots we talked about. You're thinking now from medium format down to full frame, that smaller sensor size. So I'm going to flip it to portrait orientation, and I'm going to take 3 shots. I want to make sure there's a slight overlap between each one so they can stitch together nicely on the computer. I'm going to fill the frame on the center one with my subject, flick to the left, and then flick to the right. A couple of things I need to make sure of when I'm doing this. I can't change my plane of focus at all. I have to make sure that the camera stays exactly the same distance from the subject, or that focus plane will shift. This is nice if you've got a ball head on a tripod, because you can just use that ball head and flip it on a swivel like this. I don't, I've got a geared head. So all I'm going to do is use my hand on the top here and use this tripod as a little pivot point to make sure I'm not moving forwards or backwards. And then I also need to make sure that the focus doesn't shift between shots. So I can't use this on autofocus and leave it to focus, because if I focus on the center one, it will focus on my subject. And then if I flick left and it focuses again, it'll focus on the background, and those will be 2 different focus planes. Because the Sonys are great with their face detect, I could just use autofocus on the first shot, flick it into manual, and then take the other 2. Or in this case, I've got this top button on the lens programmed so that it's my focus hold button. And you'll have a focus hold button on most cameras that you've got somewhere. So all I'm going to do is hold down halfway so it focuses on the face, press the button on the top of the lens so it holds that focus for all 3 shots, take the center shot, left shot, right shot, and I'm going to ask my subject to stay as still as she can for all 3 of those shots so we can stitch them together nicely. And with those 3 shots, we'll see how close we can get to that medium format look. Okay, so let's do the APS-C one last. I don't actually have an APS-C camera on me, so what I can do with this camera though is I actually have a super 35mm mode where it punches in on the sensor and emulates about the size of the sensor you get on a normal APS-C camera, something like a Fuji X-T camera or something like that. So I'm just going to hit the super 35mm mode, and we're going to use this as an APS-C. Obviously the lens on the front is still going to be the 50mm 1.2, so you could think of this in terms of, if you own a Fuji, this might be a Fuji X-T5 with the 56mm 1.2. That's a pretty close sort of comparison to what we're about to do here. So same thing again with my subject. I'm going to take 6 shots this time. Remember, 3 shots for that full frame will give us good coverage. We need about 6 on an APS-C. So I'm going to take a shot at the top with the head and the background, then down at the bottom of the subject, then off to the left top and bottom, right top and bottom. And I'm going to ask my subject again if she can hold pretty still for all of those shots so we can stitch them together. The settings, I didn't tell you the settings for the full frame one. It's exactly the same here. I'm on ISO 100, 1.2 obviously because we want that shallow depth of field, and 1/200th of a second. So the settings have been the same for the full frame and the APS-C. Same things I need to think about. I can't shift the plane of focus. So as I'm doing this, I need to pivot on a point and make sure I'm not moving too much. And the focus again needs to stay exactly the same for all 6 shots. So everything else still applies. We're just moving from 3 shots to 6 shots for this super 35mm mode, which is basically an APS-C sensor. Okay, so I'm back at the computer, and this is the first of the images. This is the Fuji GFX shot, the medium format shot on the 65mm Mitacon 1.4. You can see there's a lovely shallow slice of focus. My subject really stands out from the bokeh in the background, and even though it's a full-length shot with a lot of headroom, you can see she's really separated from the blur in the background. So that's what we're used to when we're seeing medium format images. That's what we think of. And if we move over here to our other images, we're starting here with our full frame shot on the Sony a7R IV. You can see I've taken one shot vertically like this with my subject in the center, one shot to the left, one shot to the right. So those are my three images. I'm in Lightroom Classic. This is very easy to do in a lot of programs. Just with my first image selected, I'm going to hold Shift and select the last of those three images, right click, come up here to Photo Merge and go to Panorama. I usually just leave it on spherical, usually seems to give me the best results for this sort of thing, and just hit merge. And there's our final shot, and it looks pretty good. And we've got that very shallow depth of field, we've got that wider angle with those three shots stitched together, and I think that's pretty close to what we think of as medium format just taken on a full frame. The next shots are the APS-C shots where we punched in on Super 35mm mode, about a 1.5 times crop, so similar to your Fuji X-T range or something like that. You can see what I did. We did a shot of my subject in the center with her head and above, and then her bottom half. Then we did left top, left bottom, right top, right bottom. So all we're going to do is exactly the same here. Process, we're going to select the first of those shots. We're going to hold Shift, left click, and we're going to select the last one. Right click, and we're going to go to Photo Merge. I'm going to plow through that. I'm going to generate these previews, generate each of these stitches, pull them into Photoshop, getting them looking similar, and then let's look at these three images side by side. So I've just done a little bit of cropping and a bit of color grading just to match them up a little bit. I didn't want to take you through that because this video is already getting long. But let's take a look at them now. So this is the medium format shot that we took on the GFX. And you can see that nice bokeh, nice separation. This is the full frame shot, and we're pretty close. You can see that there's a little bit of a lens distortion change. The medium format shot feels slightly more zoomed in and compressed, but that's obviously because we're shooting with a 65mm and then we're moving on the full frame to a 50mm stitched together. So that makes sense that it would do that, but I want you to focus more on the fact that my subject is separated and the quality of the bokeh in the background being similar. And then this is the APS-C shot. You can see very similar results again. We've got that similar bokeh quality in the background and similar sense of separation. So here again, we've got our medium format shot, 3 full frame shots stitched together, and 6 APS-C shots stitched together. And I think they all look like that traditional medium format 3-dimensional sort of image. Yes, the light's changing slightly between them. Yes, there's a slight barrel distortion change with the 65mm to the 50mm, but otherwise I think we're pretty close. And I hope that goes to show you that with the camera you have, you can get pretty close to that medium format look. So I hope that's helped, and it's got you thinking about the potential of you taking the camera that you already have to create those wide but shallow images for yourself, those images that we more readily associate with cameras with much larger sensors. And yes, it's going to mean that you have to slow your process down a lot. You're going to have to take your time to really nail your focus and line your shots up. It's going to take a little bit more post-processing, but maybe slowing down our process is not the worst thing in the world. If you wanted an even shallower depth of field, all you need to do is go to longer focal lengths. So for years, I shot these sort of images on an 85mm 1.8 lens, which obviously I needed to take more images to fill the same amount of theoretical sensor space. And it meant that my images were still wide, but they had an even shallower depth of field. My only caution with that would be that this quest to get the narrowest slice of focus that we possibly can doesn't necessarily help us tell a better story. It becomes this slippery slope where we try and make these images that are technically interesting, but we can often just create a bit of a mess and things start to look unreal. So if you want my advice, start simple, like I've shown you in this video. Another benefit that's worth mentioning is if you take this technique and use it and you're stitching images together, you're going to wind up with final images with really big resolutions. If you think about it, those images I took on a full frame camera were on a Sony a7R IV, which has 61 megapixels. So when I stitch together 3 images, I've actually got a final image that's almost 180 megapixels big. And say you're doing the APS-C route and you've got an X-T5, for example, and you're taking 6 images, that's a 40 megapixel camera. 6 times 40 is going to give you 240 megapixel final files, which is obviously going to look great in print. Just a little announcement before I go. The 4th volume of my magazine, Parable, is at the printers as we speak and is probably available when this video comes out. It's called Going Rural, and it shares some of the images that I've been making up here in North Yorkshire, where I've lived for the last 3 years. And in the text, I'm talking about what it's actually like to move from a city to the countryside and how that changes your photography. So if you're interested in that, as usual, there are a limited number of copies. Visit the link below and check it out. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode. If you need a new website or a domain, they're a fantastic option. I've used them for over a decade now as my website of choice. One of the things I love about Squarespace is I really want to have a good looking website, but I know I'm a photographer, I'm not necessarily a designer. But they have a whole host of templates put together by professional designers that are really clean and minimal to look at, so my work does the talking, and they couldn't be easier to use. In the back end, I don't need to know any coding. I can just click and drag in text blocks and image blocks and videos and contact forms and set up a whole store, and it takes me no time at all to put together a website that I can be proud of, that puts my images and my work front and center. Start your free trial today at squarespace.com. and go to squarespace.com/Sean Tucker to get 10% off your first purchase.